I'm Brianna Rose with the Mill City Times, and I'm here with Representative Ilhan Omar. Representative Omar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brianna.
So the first thing I'd like to talk about is your appointment to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, specifically the Subcommittee for Africa Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations. And I'm wondering, what are some of the major issues or topics you'd like to see tackled by the subcommittee?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It's really great to be here with you. As someone who represents a large African diaspora community and the firstborn African immigrant to serve in Congress, I'm particularly excited to be able to play a leadership role in overseeing our international aid and foreign policy on the continent. My focus will be around basic human rights around the world, because I know that's a priority for the district as well. And I think in the midst of a global pandemic that has devastated people's livelihoods everywhere, it's going to be important to make sure that the most valuable, the most vulnerable people here in Minnesota and around the world are able to get access to much needed aid and medicine.
That's a great goal. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And I've read that you like to engage and empower young women of color to take on civic leadership roles. And I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you do this?
Yeah, I've always said you don't need permission or an invitation to exist and to step into power. Our country deserves equal representation to reflect the portrait of America. And actually, just a quick story. I remember in 2016, when I first got elected to the Minnesota House before I was sworn in, Somalia, the country that I was born in, was having elections, and it was part of one of those countries that had quotas imposed on them where women should receive 30% representation. And they got close to 27%. And the women were celebrating, and they asked them, the international community asked, how can we help in that celebration? And they said, it'd be really nice if Ilhan was able to join us and celebrate with us, because it's really cool that she gets to be the first Somali woman to get elected into any office in the United States. And so they asked if I would come. I said yes. I went there and I had a meeting with the then president of Somalia. And, he said, isn't it exciting that we're doing this? And I said, well, you could have gotten to the 30%. Why didn't you push for the 30%? And he said, do you know the lack of representation of women in the United States Congress? And at the time, I really did it, right? Because in the United States, we think that there is equal representation. We have equality here in the United States as women. And I said no. And he said, it's only 19%. At the time, it was 19%. And I was ashamed of that. And I remember coming back, and we had the Women's March, and I put that in my speech because I thought it was really important for us to focus on that, because oftentimes as women here in the United States who have all kinds of privileges, it's easy for us to look at women around the world to say, how can we empower you, without realizing that even here in the United States, we need to empower ourselves to seek those positions of power, to be CEOs, to be the members of our city council, members of our state legislature, in Congress, and to set that example for the next generation of women. And I think right now, seeing the kind of representation that we have with this incoming Congress, it's really a testament, I think, of the work that was done from the Women's March movement and the visibility that women like myself got as we entered Congress, that has inspired so many women to say, I can do this too. And I think, when you can see, you can be, and just being visibly in positions of power in itself, I think is a way to motivate and empower young women to see themselves in positions of power.
Was there anyone in particular that inspired you, or a mentor that inspired you to run for public office and take on a role like this?
I mean, I think there were a couple of inspirations. Oftentimes for a woman like me who ultimately became a first, it's hard to see, right? An example of someone like you who's there, and so it's internally overcoming the barriers that you think are out there for yourself. And for me, it was hard to see a Muslim woman who was a hijabi ever being elected in an elected office here in the United States. And I remember when my friends and colleagues would say you should run for office, I would come up with a list of reasons why, my neighbors and community would reject me because of not what I could offer, but because of what I look like. And once I overcame that, it was going through a process of seeing other women who might have had the same internal barriers imposed on themselves. And I think Shirley Chisholm was a great example of that, because at first she thought that she might not be able to do it. There were no Black women in Congress, and the idea of being a Black woman and running and people supporting you was something that she thought would not be possible. And she ultimately convinced herself, and she did it. She found an array of supporters throughout her community and throughout the country, because she was like one of the first women to run for president. And, I think for me, using her story as an inspiration to this day, existing and governing in the climate that I am, has been really good for me, and it has helped sustain me in many ways.
Well, speaking of what it's like to be in a political climate, I imagine that your daily schedule in Washington is pretty brutal. Would you mind just sharing what a typical day for you is like, and some of the ways that you try and practice self-care?
I mean, a typical day usually is, getting up, getting ready for a press call, or meeting with my staff, and then having our first set of votes. Right now, through COVID, they're stretched out because we have to practice distancing, and then in between that is running through committees, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person, and then hopping into virtual meetings with constituents who are scheduled to meet with us, and then running home to try to make dinner and feed the family. So that's typical. What I do to practice self-care, I struggle with that. I think I use my kids and their smiles as self-care most times, because they, offer an insight to a different world that is possible, right? And when the days are hard, it's good to come home and to see them, who have, these children who have no political conversations or interest in the fact that I am, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, sort of ground me into the reality of what's really important in life.
I agree. Children's insight, and they can just be a breath of fresh air sometimes when you need it because their life is so unaffected. So, um, the last thing I'd like to ask you is when you get to come back and spend time in Minnesota, do you have any restaurants, any favorites that you like to visit? COVID has hit the restaurant industry so hard, and we've seen so many great restaurants either close their doors temporarily or permanently. And I'm just wondering, are there any out there that you particularly like to go and visit when you have the chance?
Yes, I am not a big food person, so I don't really frequent too many restaurants or particularly have restaurants that I like. I can kind of sort of find myself in any restaurant and enjoy it. I am nostalgic in many ways, though. So when I'm in DC, it's very challenging to cook or find restaurants that provide Somali food that I would normally make at home. And so when I'm in Minneapolis, if I'm not cooking, I'm trying to eat Somali food. It's the best way that I can get a taste of my goat meat and Somali tea. And I usually go to Safari, or there's a restaurant in Cedar Riverside called MashaAllah. But diners are my favorite after that. So I'm in like High Low, Uptown Diner, Nicollet Diner. I'm a coffee junkie, so anywhere that I can go where they have free flowing coffee is my favorite place.
I'm a coffee junkie as well, so I feel that 100%. Thank you so much for joining me today, Representative Omar.
Yeah, thank you for having me.